Hey everybody, welcome to another Mythic Monday, where we'll be reviewing Week 4 and looking ahead to Week 5, talking about the forming healer meta, the difficulty of the various dungeons. Then we'll look ahead to Week 5, talk about the different affixes, strategize around that. Let's get into it. So the healer meta is starting to look pretty solidly formed at this point. We've got Resto Druid at the top spot week after week, closely followed by Preservation Evoker. Holy Paladin solidly in the third spot, Holy Priest consistently in fourth, and then Disc, Resto Shaman, and Mistweaver bringing up the rear. I also want to quickly remind you guys that this is not my personal tier list. This is a data-driven tier list that's constantly updated on the Subcreation website. I'm just reacting to it. It's a great website, and if you've never used it, I'd strongly recommend you take a look. You can learn a lot about talents and gear for your class there as well. But if you feel the need to comment on the tier list, go for it, but I didn't make it. These are just the facts. I've said since the beginning, I thought Preservation had what it takes to potentially pass up Resto Druid as the top spec, mainly due to the damage it deals. Early in the week, Preservation was actually in the top spot, but at some point, Druid overtook it again. I do think Druid has a bit of an edge on Tyrannical weeks, where Evoker does have a couple bosses where its limited range holds it back a little bit, while Druid doesn't really have any particular boss that it can't handle. That's likely the difference between top S tier and second place in Tyrannical week. I could still see Evoker doing better on a Fortified week, but that also comes down to what top groups are running more of. In the midsection, Holy Paladin is standing in a strong third place week after week. Holy Paladin has a good amount of throughput and the best healer utility in the game, as well as personal immunity. No big surprises here. One thing I realized when I was making my Druid versus Evoker video is that Paladin would rank really highly head-to-head with those healers in almost every aspect. And it's just mainly how easily they are able to deal with the massive AoE damage that puts them in front. Paladin's survivability, utility, and ability to passively heal the tank through beacons are absolutely awesome, and it's definitely a healer I want to try and spend a little more time on in the coming weeks. If you follow the channel much over the last few months, you know I have a soft spot for Holy Priest. I really enjoyed playing it in Shadowlands and actually really like the way Holy played in Dragonflight, especially the updates made to its damage rotation. The main idea of the healing rotation from Shadowlands is still intact, but I think what really hurt Holy is just the type of healing needed in dungeons this season. Big, chunky, machine gun style single target heals were exactly what you needed in Shadowlands, but with Dragonflight being more AoE focused, Holy struggles a bit more. Still, I think Holy is a bit underrated, and Mass Dispel has some really, really great moments in this dungeon pool. So I feel like we've hammered the bottom specs really hard in previous Mythic Mondays, so I don't want to get too far into those this time around. We know Mistweaver, Resto Shaman, and Disc Priest struggle in dungeon comment. They're going to continue to struggle, and it's not going to stop until they get some big changes. End of story. I think we can just leave it at that for now. Moving on to dungeon difficulty, Shadow Moon and Court of Stars seem to have locked themselves into the S and A tier. The only movement takes place below that. We did have some nerfs come in this week to Algathar Academy, Azure Vault, Knockhut Offensive, and Ruby Life Pools on some of the bosses that have been giving people the most trouble. Knockhut remains in B tier since last week, so it might be establishing itself as one of the easier dungeons outside of the big two. I continue to be surprised to see this dungeon as high as it is on Subcreation. In my many pug runs, this one actually seems to be one of the harder ones to me, where both trash and bosses pose quite a problem. The elemental boss does feel a little bit easier after the nerfs, but it's still a challenge. It's really important to make sure that as a healer, you keep yourself at that 10 stack of the balls so that your heals are really impactful. But apparently, my experience here is not the universal experience, so good job on Knockhut. You guys keep knocking it out of the park, because I am not doing so in this dungeon yet. And now we have Algathar moving way up. It's worth mentioning that this was a solid F tier in the last Tyrannical week that we had. I really like the nerf that was implemented here on the Ancient boss, as it doesn't really make the boss weaker. It just lines the abilities up in a more fair way and makes them more manageable to deal with. I thought that boss felt a lot more fair from the healer perspective now, and it didn't get the weird overlap where your green circle is full of brown badness, and it just made the entire fight more manageable. Other bosses in here are still going to present a problem on Tyrannical weeks, and I don't think this one's ever going to be a walk in the park, but at least the first boss isn't always ending the run before it even starts now. So here's a new one. Ruby Life Pools is actually moving up the tier list. This was consistently the hardest dungeon for the first couple of weeks, but a series of nerfs has brought it a lot more in line. As a healer, I actually do enjoy the challenge of this dungeon, and with experience and learning exactly when damage is coming out, it gets much easier. All 3 bosses do pose a challenge and will push you as a healer, and this is a dungeon where more than maybe any other, you really feel the difference between a group that uses defensives and CCs, understands the mechanic really well, and those that doesn't. Even on a tyrannical week, the inner circle of fire elementals can still be a little bit tricky if people aren't kicking, interrupting, and just generally doing mechanics right. But overall, I feel like this is a challenging dungeon. It's always going to be on the harder side, but at least it's more fair now. Jade Serpent remains on the harder side of average this week. As tyrannical keys get higher and higher, all the bosses can be pretty dangerous. Even Wise Mari, which is a fight where storming was actually a bit of a pain on. The healing requirements go up a lot when you're sort of tested in every way in here, with Mari being a mechanic execution, the second boss, well, sometimes the first boss, being straight up healing throughput, the third being single target, and the fourth being dispel management. On top of this, there's some trash in here that's pretty tough even on a tyrannical week, so it's no surprise the community at large struggles in here a little bit. Halls of Valor has fallen down the list considerably since our last tyrannical week, where it was B tier. The likely explanation for this is that people are doing higher keys now and that this dungeon scales to be pretty tough. The timer in here doesn't allow for a lot of mistakes, and as keys get higher, Herja and Fenrir can really put your healing abilities to the test on a tyrannical week. My personal experience here differs quite a bit from this tier list, as I actually find this to be a little bit easier, and I'd probably swap it with Naka given my own experience, but hey, we all have our dungeons that we're more or less comfortable in. Could be my love for God King Skovald. Who knows? And once again, bringing up the rear in the F tier, it's Azurvault. Despite even more nerfs to Azurblade, this dungeon stands alone as the hardest key of the week, and I totally agree with this. In my opinion, the timer on this place is simply too tight and needs 2 to 4 minutes added to it. One wipe in here basically ends your run on a decent level key. The runbacks are god-awful. Every boss in this place poses a serious threat, and a lot of the trash may not be super difficult, but much of it is very time-consuming and tedious. I'm currently channeling all my YouTube fame and fortune toward getting this timer extended. Blizzard, don't let me down. Looking ahead to next week, we have Fortified, Spiteful, Grievous, Thundering. Spiteful is one of my all-time least favorite affixes, even though there isn't anything really necessarily hard about it. It's kind of similar to Sanguine, it just really bogs everything down. Groups should be using CCs and slows to avoid Spitefuls and try not to waste time killing them whenever possible. I can see Spiteful being an extra pain next week since the DPS meta is so heavily melee right now, it seems. So keep an eye on melee players not reacting fast enough and getting ghost busted. Grievous is already back after just a couple weeks off. We all know that there is some really tough trash in Dragonflight Season 1, and Fortified Grievous isn't going to make it any easier. Grievous can also make some Fortified bosses quite difficult, and all in all, I see this as a really lousy week to push keys. However, we don't really have the option to just jam out 815s and call it a week this expansion with gear scaling so high, so buckle up for some really nasty trash pulls and be ready for those ghosts spawning afterwards. I find it a little odd we've already repeated Grievous and Raging twice this season, but still haven't seen some affixes at all. Alright, so that wraps it up on week 4 going into week 5. If you have any thoughts about the forming healer meta, the difficulty of the various dungeons, or next week's affixes, don't forget to leave that down in the comments section. As always, if you made it this far, I appreciate a like on the video, subscribe to see more in the future, and of course, you can check me out live here on stream on YouTube Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, 9 p.m. Pacific. Love to see you there. Until next time, happy healing.